Today's lecture is part of CCS's series on the anniversary of the Nines, a series of lectures that look at the fact that several momentous events in Chinese history occurred during the 20th century in years ending in the number 9. For Tibet, that number is 1959, 1959, and particularly March 10th of that date, the day of the Tibetan National Uprising, which led to the Dalai Lama's flight into exile shortly thereafter. So the anniversary was March 10th, 2009. I was teaching my class, Introduction to Tibetan Buddhism, last semester. It was a Tuesday-Thursday class. March 10th fell on a Tuesday, and as I prepared my syllabus, I decided to leave that day blank because I knew there would be things for us to discuss, news coming from Tibet on March 10th, 2009, the 50th anniversary of the uprising. However, nothing happened at all. Everything was shut down. And the reason for that was that everything had happened in March 2008, where there were uprisings throughout the Tibet Autonomous Region, and particularly and significantly outside of the TAR, in Yunnan, in Sichuan, in Gansu, in Qinghai, in Tibetan regions of those provinces. And the person most responsible for bringing news of those events to the scholarly and journalistic communities of North America was our speaker today, Tsering Shakya, who was able to speak to people by telephone, to translate blogs from Tibetan and from Chinese, and to let those events be known to the wider world. Tsering Shakya is the Canadian Research Chair in Religion and Contemporary Society at the Institute for Asian Research at UBC. He is known for many skills in our community of Tibetan studies. He's most famous for his 1999 work, Dragon in the Land of Snows, which is the definitive history of the events of 1959, their prelude and their aftermath. He's also our leading scholar of Tibetan literature in the post-1959 period, especially for a period in the 1980s of a Tibetan Renaissance in arts, poetry, and fiction during that time. He's also working on a book on the 13th Dalai Lama. So he is really our leading expert on modern Tibet. It's a great pleasure to introduce him today to speak on China's Tibet policy, accommodation, and conflict. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much, Don, for the kind introduction. Last year, in March 10th, Tibet erupted in wave of protests, which propelled the sort of in the international media headline and drew huge sort of public attention. But what was most interesting is the level of attention it's received in China, and particularly among Chinese population. And this is the first time in PRC's history where there was a very much popular public participation on Tibet issues by the Chinese citizens, both the Chinese diaspora living abroad and within China. And while the media and the populist sort of discourse tend to portray the Chinese view as sort of monolithic and one view of resurgence of Han nationalism, but I would say it is impossible to have one view of China on regards to Tibet, because the population is so big, there's so much diversity within China on every issue. So Tibet issue also withdrew certain kind of divergent views within China about the ultimate rightness or wrongness of PRC's policy towards Tibet. This talk, I want to really concentrate on a very broad view of looking at the PRC's policy towards Tibet over the last 50 years. And to do that, I sort of look at the PRC's policy in not as a continuous one sort of policy rhetoric or one metaphor, but looking at throughout the period and way PRC saw Tibet issue in different light. And this I have divided sort of three sort of periods in where PRC developed its policy Tibet. When the founding of the new People's Republic of China in 1949 and the establishment of the Communist Party rule in China, the early periods, PRC's primary interest in Tibet was issue of unification and sovereignty. And why this issue of sovereignty and unification became the key was that prior to establishment of PRC, when you look at it from the late Qing periods to 1950, Tibet was virtually what the scholars call de facto independent. Although it did not have international recognition as an independent state, nevertheless it functioned as an independent state. And by independence, if we take sort of political science definition of it as having a state having both the internal sovereignty and external power to relate to other states. In this sense, that Tibet between, particularly from 1911 to 1950, engages in external relationship. It made treaties with the foreign power, particularly British India. It's granted rights for travelers in Tibet. Say before 1950, anyone who wished to climb the Mount Everest didn't seek permission from the Chinese government. It has to be sought permission from the Lhasa government. So that Tibet exercising some degree of sovereignty within its own territory. And internally, any sort of remnants of Qing authority or the Kuomintang authority in Tibet was erased from 1911 to 1950. For the communists, this reflects the China's own weakness and weakness caused by Western incursion and Western imperialism and the dismemberment of China. Chinese perception of the Tibetan independence period is not as seen as something of indigenous development movement of Tibetan agency, but mainly as connivance and conspiracy of Western imperialists to dismember China. So, and one of the accusations against the nationalist regime under Kuomintang by the communists is that it had allowed the Tibet to be dismembered and being separated from China. So communists claims that they unified Tibet within China. If you look at the almost all the exchanges or documentation that happened, their primary aim was unification of Tibet. And if you look at the rhetoric at the time, it's very similar to rhetoric PRC today use in relationship with Taiwan and earlier times with Hong Kong. At the time, there was a very little rhetoric or concerns about liberation of the Tibetan serfs or socialist transformation of Tibet, because they did not want to perturb the Tibetan ruling elites. Were the communists were to talk about liberation of the Tibetan peasantry or social reforms, this would have engendered antagonism from the ruling elite. So between 1950 to 60, the Communist Party policy was very much geared towards wooing the ruling elite, particularly of Dalai Lama and his court and the Tibetan aristocracy. And there was, I call the Tibetan peasantry was left in sort of benign neglect in that period. How did the communists achieve that aim of unification? It's partly, I think, through, mostly through, I would say, through coercion. If you look at the earlier exchange that went on between the Tibetans were, all intents purpose, determined to keep their independence. But it was communists in the early period, they did not want to use military force. But inevitably, they felt that if the negotiation would continue, that there was no way of bringing the Tibetans voluntary in unification with China, that Tibet would not agree. So in 6th of March, 6th of October 1950, the communists launched an invasion of Tibet and crossed the Yangtze into Tibet. The Tibetan army consists mostly of no more than 5,000 soldiers, were easily defeated by well-equipped, well-experienced, and battle-hardened communist PLA soldiers. This forced the Tibetans to reach an agreement, which is officially the party calls it the Agreement for the Peaceful Liberation of Tibet, and the Tibetans just simply call it as the 17-point agreement. And if you look at the 17-point agreement, the article, actually it has almost the same features that today enjoyed by Hong Kong. It's more or less like one country, two system, which promises Tibetan that the entire social systems and the political system of Tibet will not be altered, and the Tibet will legally, constitutionally, it will be part of China. Nevertheless, Tibet will enjoy a great degree of autonomy, and all the social reforms and changes that happen in China would not be implemented in Tibet. Were the Tibetans happy to accept the agreement? I don't think so, but the agreement was best possible solution to the situation. It was an agreement which the Tibetans felt possible to live with China, because China's main concern was the issue of sovereignty, and the Tibetans, the main concern was cultural autonomy and the autonomy of the existing system. If this was guaranteed, there was possible accommodation between China and Tibet. But in fact, if you look at the agreement, its main architect of the agreement was Deng Xiaoping, who was then in 1950s the military commander, political commissar of the Southwest Military Region, and was one of the key figures in drawing up the 17-point agreement. And this is no coincidence. Similarly, in 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping came back to power, he drew similar plan for Hong Kong. So this was the period which there was some kind of hope that Tibet and China could accommodate and live together. But this agreement failed, and we know it failed because of the 1959 revolt. And why that revolt happened is now much of a historical debate. What was the cause of the debate? And PRC's view is this revolt was primarily caused by external agitation, particularly by the United States, and involvement of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, in the Tibetan affair. Remember, this was also a period of the Cold War, so there was a great fear of external. I have written and argued that the immediate cause of the uprising or the Tibetan failure of the agreement has nothing to do with the external involvement of United States. In fact, it's the United States' involvement in the 1950s happened much later, after the revolt itself, not a period before the revolt. And what you see is main failure of the agreement was that the failure both from the Lhasa regime and failure of PRC to recognize Tibetan ethnicity. When you look at the 17-point agreement, it's only applied to the autonomous region, or present-day autonomous region, or the area which was really under the control of the Dalai Lama. The vast territory of Tibetan areas in Qinghai, what the Tibetans call Amdo, and in Sichuan, did not, the agreement was not applied, in that they were treated just like any other province situation and province in China. And from 1954 onwards, the communists began to implement the land reforms and socialist transformation in eastern Tibet and this region. And the first revolt happened in these areas, in Qinghai and Sichuan. And therefore, when these refugees from Qinghai and Sichuan fled to the autonomous region, actually communists, the PLA didn't really take much action. But what was interesting is that suppression of the revolt in eastern Tibet created a new kind of fear within China, within Tibet, in that idea that this kind of reform will be inevitably will be introduced in Tibet, despite the communist promise of internal autonomy, that eventually this reform will come to Tibet. So there is a fear that it's only a matter of time before similar policies will be implemented in Tibet. And another sort of transformation that took place in China is the anti-rightist campaign. Anti-rightist campaign was essentially launched against liberal elements within the Communist Party. And the casualty of that campaign were many of the people who were involved in drawing up Tibet policy, head of the nationalities policy, Li Weihan, including Deng Xiaoping, and many of the liberal elements who wanted to go more sort of at slower pace in promoting reforms in the minority areas, lost their position within party. And in fact, one of the accusations against these leaders was that they have compromised excessively with the Dalai cliques and the upper stratas or minority groups and elites, and they are postponing socialism in these minority regions. So that meant the new kind of sort of urgency for socialist transformation of the minority regions and Tibet in areas was urged by hardliners within the party. And what the 17-point agreement gave China is it is really the first time international legitimacy for Chinese position in Tibet, and also internal legitimacies to the communist involvement in Tibet, because the agreement was signed and agreed, endorsed by the Dalai Lama. So that has a certain, and what is very interesting, one of the conditions of the 17-point agreement was that China will handle all Tibet's external affairs, and Tibet will cease to have any external relationship with foreign states, including neighboring states like Nepal, Bhutan, or India, and all external relations will be with China, will be handled by. Secondly, it's allowed PLA to be stationed in Tibet. Two conditions which party demand from the Tibetan for all the concession they were willing to make was: first, Tibet should sever all its external relationship. Second, PLA must be stationed in Tibet. So this was a primary thing. And the idea that you would immediately see concerns in State Department and foreign government. It says once Tibet had signed that the right for that Tibet will cease to have external relationship, then for State Department could not really have relationship with the Tibetan officials, or Tibet cannot engage in relationship formal level with India or any of the neighboring states or foreign states. So that was very important for the China. And it gave certain kind of legalistic legitimacy to the PRC, establishment of PRC rule in Tibet. So 1950 to 60, communists achieved the establishment of their sovereignty over Tibet. Now, there's a huge debate within the Tibetan community whether such the agreement was valid or whether the agreement was signed under coercion or not. But I think at the time, the Tibetan rulers felt this was a possible agreement they could reach and could accommodate coexistence between China and Tibet. Of course, from 1960 to 70, like Tibet, the party dispensed any kind of special conditions for Tibet and was treated like the rest of China. And the idea was socialist transformation. Well, that meant introduction of land reforms, introduction of the mutual aid sort of production teams, then eventually to communization of Tibetan peasantry. So this period, now looking back, we see as sort of one of the greatest failure in Tibet and also in China. Instead of actually improving the economic conditions of the Tibetan people, really until 1976, the economic condition of ordinary Tibetan peasantry actually was far below what they enjoyed in 1950. In fact, economic condition really declined. It is just simply about the failures and mismanagements of the communization process in Tibet. And this 1976, after the death of Mao and the coming into fall of Deng Xiaoping and his modernization program, was really one of the periods Tibet began to revive both economically and culturally. And this was a period Tibetans looked as one of the really sort of most favorable periods in the recent history of Tibet. What happened was, under the liberalization policy, the party withdrew from many spheres of public life, and the Tibetan religion was allowed to come to the fore. Many revivals in Tibetan religious institutions begins to be established, and also particularly Tibetan language began to be revived in Tibet. And there was attempt. It was actually 1985. My mother came out of Lhasa, and she was saying that it was really the best period they had. There was a period of plenty. There's a great degree of social autonomy and accommodation, and they owe this particularly to Huyabang. Huyabang is one leader in Tibet which is most popular among the Tibetans in that. Huyabang initiated many of the changes which allowed essentially the sort of greater autonomy of private lives and social life in Tibet. And he also withdrew 60,000 Han cadres out of Tibet and began process of Tibetanization of the cadre and institutions in Tibet. But this was also did not last very long. Some of the problems is not really about within situations in Tibet. The Tibet situation always has to be looked in the context of larger politics of China. Whether the sort of liberals within the party are in ascendancy or more hardliners are in ascendancy, it always has a huge impact on Tibet. Now, Huyabang fell from power, and why his sort of liberal regime that he promoted, not just in Tibet but within China, became sort of less favored within the Communist Party, is much more of debates within the party rather than in the context of what's happening in Tibet. Of course, one of the accusations, like in 1958, made against Deng Xiaoping and Li Weihan, is similarly made against Huyabang, in that he had excessively compromised with the Tibetan demands and Tibetan sentiments. In fact, when he fell from grace, many of the Han cadres in Tibet were very happy and celebrated his downfall. And in fact, he is, even today, since last year's demonstration, many accuse the roots of this demonstration as stemming from Hu Yaobang's excessive compromise with the Tibetan, thereby leading to accentuation of Tibetan nationalist and sentiment. So the third period was sort of, again, there was of change, and also Tibetan public on the one hand was also quite happy and welcome these changes. But new sort of rhetoric now the Communist Party is developing in Tibet to the present is really about issue of Tibet is essentially question of development and modernization. Tibet has been the party's chief concern, and the way they look at Tibet is to say Tibet has never fully been integrated within the PR system because physically it had been separated. Because if you look at the Tibetan plateau, it is not fully integrated within the main structures and systems of China. It stood out there of this geographical separation, the spatial separation, accentuates the Tibetan sense of separateness, Tibetan sense of independence. Therefore, what really needs to be done today is to integrate Tibet fully within China. And this idea of development and modernization is essentially disguised sort of rhetoric for greater establishment of greater linkage and integration of the Tibetan plateau within the PRC. Now, two things happened with the promotion of development and modernization. First is establishment of infrastructure. The Chinese government often makes great deal of claims about amount of money they spend in Tibet. I'm just going to show you a figure. Now, this is from book by Andrew Fisher. I just got. When you look at the major amount of the spending, sorry, this is not in color, so you can't really see the different thing. But I want to say that majority of the government investment in Tibet is really essential infrastructure building. Of course, most famous the establishment of the railway, the road, power station, and what I call the structures of governance. That is, they are attempting to build within Tibet. And when you look at the least amount of money is spent is on agriculture, and when you look at, say, 98% of the Tibetan population are really farmers and nomads, there's very little investment at that level. So most of the investment is really infrastructural claim. So when the government says we spend all this money, and Tibetans saying that we are not receiving that kind of level of investment, it's essentially level of investments is all to do with infrastructure building. And the aim is to establish greater linkage within China. So that will not only facilitate flow of capitals and economic integration, but also integration of administration and infrastructure. But secondly, this will provide more conduit for internal migration of Hans into Tibetan area. Now, this is become very problematic in China. One of the accusations leveled by the Tibetan is the number of Han migrants entering into the Tibetan areas. Anyone who has traveled to Lhasa can immediately see that today Lhasa is increasingly becoming predominantly Han city. It could be any other city in sort of low-ranking townships in any part of China than Tibet. And according to Chinese government official statistics, there are only 70,000 Chinese in Tibet. And because they see about a million of Hans who have settled in Tibet, not really as residents in Tibet, because they don't really have the Hoku resident permit to be in Tibet. They are called the floating population. So when the Tibetan public perception is whether they have the resident permit or not, there are Chinese who are coming to live there. So Chinese see the migration Han in the Tibetan area as one, that are not permanent. They are basically temporary. Secondly, they don't have legal right to settle for long term because they don't have the resident permit in Tibet. So it is a temporary problem. But I would say there is a very different nature of Han migration into Tibet. If you look at the period of socialist transformation, majority of Hans who were sent there really didn't want to be in Tibet. They were, sent there as a punishment. Whether they were cadres or they were sent down students, they were all sent there, and they were eagerly waiting to go back to China. And as soon as Mao died, many did return and petitioned them to be allowed to return back to their home provinces. Now, this new type of migrants that coming from 85 onwards is very different. In fact, they are not sent by the government. It's genuinely true that they are coming on their own accord. There are many incentives and where government allows free movement of Hans into Tibet. But same time, they're migrant in sense, they are moving there thinking that I can make better life in Tibet. It's a really immigrant sort of mentality that you're going there because you think your future is brighter there. You can make a living there, and you can your prospect for your children are better in Tibet. So this new type of migrant are coming as a settlers. And there are many incentives and conducives provided the government for their move in Tibet. So this allows feeling of more of integration of Tibet within Russia. The migrants are favored by the Chinese state because it is seen as a way of diluting the Tibetan unique characteristic and attempt to maintain Tibet as totally separate from the exclusive idea that the Tibetan plateau is exclusive terrain of the ethnic Tibetan is no longer acceptable to the Communist Party. And whereas the mingling of ethnicity is seen as way of harmonizing the whole plateau, and there will be greater identification of the plateau with the rest of China. So these are the sort of different stages of communist policy, and today the primary aim is when they speak of modernization development, essentially it is about integrating and diluting this Tibetan sort of separateness from China in both physically sense of it and the cultural and population sense of separateness of Tibet, which made it sort of separate from China. Now, if we look at the last year's demonstration that happened, it is really unprecedented in the scale in which the demonstration took place. If you, eastern side, you have north is the Qinghai areas. So you have down here, these are all the places with names is the towns and townships and villages where demonstrations took place. And it spreads in the 5 provinces in the autonomous region, Gansu, Qinghai, Yunnan, and Sichuan. And these are the sort of Tibetan populated area. And this is what is really interesting and remarkable about that demonstration is, firstly, it's a geographical spread. It's a huge area of all the areas where Tibetans are population demonstration happened simultaneously in that. Secondly, if you look at the earlier demonstrations in 1980s, it was really confined to Lhasa and participated by what I call the urban poor in Lhasa. This time, the demonstration cut across all class, gender, status. It involved the mostly of common people, villagers, and ordinary citizens. But also there was participation of students and participation by university students. Particularly, and the demonstration just not happened in the Tibetan area. The Tibetan university students in Beijing also protested. So other parts of China where the Tibetan students were studying, they also engage in a form of protest. And so this was, I would call almost a nationwide, almost that who were involved in the scale of the protest. Now, again, nature and cause of the protests is always debated. From the PRC's rhetoric and narrative of this protest was essentially, it was engineered by outsiders and by the Dalai cliques, particularly from India and the anti-China forces in the West, who engineered this demonstration. Tibetan sort of narrative is this is a popular protest that, by the populace in general. Now, of course, immediate precipitating sort of factor is certainly the Olympic game was very important. There was, before the Olympic game, there was sense within Tibetans living outside and inside Tibet that there is somehow this was such an important moment for Tibetans to make a statement. And because China made the Olympic as a very important event in Chinese history and where China's sort of publicity and to the international community, that there was a very strong sense that Tibetans also wanted to make their statement. So certainly, if Olympic game wasn't being held in China and the intensity and the level at which Chinese state was promoting the Olympic Games, that Chinese Tibetans wouldn't have engaged in the demonstration last year. It could happen another time, but why 2008 is precisely because of the Olympic game. But that does not really explain the actual why so many people participate. And lastly, I want to look at it quickly in two of the main problems, contemporary problems in Tibet. And many who have commented on the demonstration tend to look at the sort of demonstration and narrative as essentially Tibetans have been disadvantaged by the modernization process in China, and they are economically neglected during in this modernization process, and the expression of the economic disadvantage felt by the demonstration is expression of disadvantage felt by the Tibetans. But I tend to see the demonstration not necessarily about economic. It's about governance and question of legitimacy. And I look at the Chinese state in Tibet faces, and I think continue to face a problem of question of legitimacy. Now, to illustrate the issue of legitimacy, I'll give one example about religion. One of the issue is about the Panchen Lama, recognition of the Panchen Lama. In 1989, when the Panchen Lama died, the Chinese government went on and selected its own candidate and recognized the child as the legitimate Panchen Lama, and Dalai Lama went on to propose his own candidate as the legitimate Panchen Lama. So the child recognized by the Dalai Lama has disappeared. We don't know where the child and or the family are now, but child recognized by the Chinese government as the legitimate Panchen Lama is in China and is promoted by the state as the Panchen Lama. Now, China faces a huge problem with that recognition process. While state had all the means and power to do that and impose its own candidate, but today all the monasteries in Tibet refuse to accept the child recognized by the party. And the child is not even recognized by the Panchen Lama's official monastery, Teshilumbo. The child cannot even go to the monastery to reside. Normally, the child would reside in his own monastery. And so Beijing went around trying to find all the Buddhist monastery to house the child and said, you got to make this as residence for the Panchen Lama. And almost all the Tibetan monasteries said no, they will not accept the child. They will not recognize the child as because he has not been recognized by the Dalai Lama. So child is now left wandering in Beijing and often also occasional travels, homeless, has no monastery, has no follower. But if he will be 19 next year and he will become member of the NPCP and eventually made into head of the Buddhist Association, but has no legitimacy in China. One of the biggest problem the communists, I think, party's mistake is the imposition of that rule. That galvanized the Tibetans far more than any other issue over there. This was essentially dealt very much with the private sentiment and religious questions of authority. There are many Tibetans who may not be overtly politically opposed to Chinese government, may not participate in the activities, but the party's campaign among the populace to accept the child's recognition galvanized the public sentiment. And the communists has now could not directly enforce the Tibetans to accept it, but at the same time this child is there. So there's a huge question of legitimacy of the party's institution. And this kind of question of legitimacy filters right down the village on many issues and authority. Second aspect, question of legitimacy within China's study, the big issue is party state and civil society relationship is a big issue. In Tibet, we will look at the Communist Party and its relationship with the Tibetan populace. There is a not policy of accommodation, and there is a policy of, I say, called antagonism between the party and the populace. Now, Tibetans' perception of the party, I categorize into sort of firstly, it is seen as an alien institution. Party is not organic to Tibet. And this is to do with the founding of the history of Communist Party. You have from the very onset of the founding of the Communist Party, there is very little Tibetan involvement. Tibetans, there was sort of few Tibetans who were part of the Long March, who children who joined them, but essentially there was really no sort of Tibetan involvement or other minority involvement in the founding and establishment of the Communist Party. So there is an assertion that the party is essentially alien institution. It's not of the people there. It's not an indigenous organization. So other aspect today, perception of the party is corrupt. Party does not dispense justice, and this is particularly when you look at many of the civil disputes in nomadic community and within Tibetan villages. In fact, they do not seek the party's mediation or the law courts, but they seek mediation from traditional forms through lamas and traditional village leaders. So they tend to resort to traditional forms of mediation and authority in Tibet. And third factor, party is essentially seen as the un-Tibetan and foreign rulers of Tibet. And this is problematic because if you look at although Communist Party in Tibet, TAR and other Tibetan area enjoys a certain number of Tibetan membership, but the perception is those who join the parties are essentially opportunists. who joined the party, and they're un-Tibetan in that. Because being a party member, you should be more stringent in your attitude to religion. You do not participate in religious festivals or community events. And if you look at the Tibetan, sort of most of the community events which brings community together is traditional forms of religious festivals. As a party member, you are not allowed to participate in these forms of activity. So you are stepping outside the Tibetan moral community. So there you are un-Tibetan. Another why parties is seen as corrupted, when you look at the higher echelons of the ethnic Tibetan Communist Party members, most of them actually came into power during the Cultural Revolution. And these people who came into the sort of party during the Cultural Revolution, and they are seen as they did so by foul means and by committing crimes. So they're very don't have a good image within the Tibetan community. So these are the two areas which the communists will find it very difficult in accommodating with Tibet today. And this is essentially comes to do with the question of governance and legitimacy. And although if you, the people who make comparison between the economic development and saying the Tibetans are disadvantaged economically, they are protesting, I think this is making incorrect comparison. If you look, say, compare Tibetan economic development in Tibet with the coastal region, of course there's a huge gap. But if you compare Tibetans with the poorer Chinese communities in the inner provinces of Gansu and other, look at the Chinese, in fact, Tibetans doing far better than many of the poor Chinese in that. So economically, actually, the Tibetans are not disadvantaged or most disadvantaged group within China. There are far more poorer groups within China who are more poorer and neglected by the current economic development. So in fact, I would say there has been some degree of Tibetan economic prosperity, and this economic prosperity has also brought more sort of impetus for cultural revival of sense of Tibetan identity in that. When you look ahead, lavishly they organize the Tibetan festivals, how much money they give to the monasteries there. There is this economic success, in fact, is bringing greater sort of revival of the Tibetan identity, and somehow this in turn accentuates the differences with China. So in China studies and in the question in China has been very much a question of the legitimacy issue and whether Communist Party will continue to have legitimacy within China as a whole. But in Tibet, certainly, the key issue will foreseeable future that it will remain a question of legitimacy, because the party finds no easy solution to being seen as the outsider and also seen as the ruler. Thank you.